Hi, so today what I want to do is to share with you all some thoughts and some fragments from philosophy that I hope will help at least mitigate, though by no means eliminate, the pain of existence. I want to say at the outset that these things I'm about to mention may not work for many of you, and in bringing these things up, I certainly don't wish to in any way trivialize the suffering people go through. So I want to begin with what are probably the most repeated words attributed to the philosopher Epictetus, namely that it is not events that trouble us, but our opinion about events. So essentially what Epictetus means by this is that the events in our lives, that is external events, are in themselves neutral, and that we are therefore harmed not by events themselves, but by our opinions about these events. So Epictetus says, for example, that people's behavior towards us is not by nature a thing that is good or bad for us. Rather, it's in the judgments we form about their behavior that the goodness or badness lies. And we being the authors of it, it's within our power and control to remove these judgments, or so Epictetus argues. This, in essence, is also what is meant when Shakespeare has Hamlet say, "There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." This statement should not, of course, be taken in an unlimited sense. Obviously, suffering is bad. It's not thinking that makes pain or suffering bad, because suffering is a thing by nature bad. Rather, what Epictetus and Shakespeare have in mind, I think, are things whose value genuinely depends on the way we think about them. In other words, everything external to us, or anything outside of minds. And I think just recognizing that externals are not by nature bad, but are turned into a source of pain and suffering by our judging them to be so. This insight, when put to good use, can certainly at times ease our pain. This idea of inner retreat and contentment is very eloquently expressed in Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, which I therefore recommend. This, of course, is likely of little use for physical torments or pains of any kind that come to us directly. Some people might worry, too, that this sort of stoic indifference can lead to moral indifference. But I don't think it does, because, again, we're not denying the badness of pain and suffering. We're just saying that some forms of suffering are avoidable if we cultivate a habit of distinguishing our judgments from things themselves. There's also some consolation in the idea that everything in our lives happens necessarily, which is to say, what happens in our lives must happen. They cannot fail to happen. And this, of course, is because every event, we presume has a cause. There's some reason it happened the way it happened, and not some other way. And this cause must have been a sufficient cause. That is, as Hobbes very neatly explains, it must have contained everything necessary for producing the effect. Because otherwise, the effect would not have followed, right? And hence, a sufficient cause, which is every cause, leaves possible only one specific outcome. Now, why is this consoling? Well, I think much of the torment of life comes from our desire for things to be other than how they turned out to be, and this false hope only increases our desires, and hence our suffering. On the other hand, if we clearly grasp the idea that multiple possibilities, or a liberty of indifference, is really an illusion, that the only possibility is what actually was, is, and will be, then we will not wish endlessly for things to be anything other than in fact are. And therefore, to wish for things to have been otherwise is really to wish for something utterly impossible. It's been said, therefore, that even the gods do not fight necessity. So in a sense, it's our powerlessness in the face of necessity that becomes a source of comfort for us. Now, this does raise interesting problems for the notion of moral responsibility, and some people at least seem to think that it poses a challenge to ethical judgments altogether. I think what it shows is that nobody, and indeed nothing, is ultimately responsible for anything that happens. However, this doesn't mean that we can't judge actions to be good or bad, right? I mean, we could still say that certain actions have better or worse consequences. And so a deterministic view of this kind does not, it seems to me, rule out the possibility of making ethical claims. There's also a certain solace in recognizing that we're miserable. So Schopenhauer famously says, there is only one inborn error, and that is the notion that we exist in order to be happy. Now, it might seem odd to call these words consoling, but I think it's deeply so because, again, it suppresses and silences our desires for anything better. By coming to terms with how bad existence is, we come to accept that suffering is so inherent to life that to wish to avoid it is pointless and futile. And it's precisely in giving up our search for happiness that we find a sort of comfort in no longer searching. But if life is very bad, uh, one might ask, why not just end it? And this is a perfectly reasonable question, given the quality of our lives. But since I've discussed this subject elsewhere, I'll avoid repeating myself here, except to say that one's decision to die ought to be respected, and indeed socially and legally supported, no less than one's decision to live. So that is all for now, and thanks for listening.